He had never once during their 2-year-long marriage said that he loved her, but he had shown her in so many ways that she had believed that was enough. In the face of his abandonment, she had come to question that love and had been forced to acknowledge that the words would have meant more, the words would have meant everything. They would have set his love in stone. Now he was standing here telling her that he had wanted Kayla after all? What was she supposed to believe? Why was he treating her like the villain for leaving, when he was the one who had driven her away? In the midst of her turmoil, she heard an unmistakable sound, the familiar irrepressible chatter and giggle of a toddler. Of a particular toddler. Bronwyn's panicked gaze swung to the open door, and she was horrified to see the babysitter leading her beautiful daughter toward the room. Her anxious gaze swung toward Bryce, but he seemed oblivious. He was watching her intently, still wanting an answer to his previous question. Rick had heard though, and his gaze was riveted on the doorway as well. Oh God, how could Katrina bring her here? How had the woman even known where to find Bronwyn? Answer me, damn you. Bryce was growling. How could he remain unaware of the approaching babble of an effervescent 18-month-old baby? He had his back to the door, and so did not see when Kayla and the now faltering Katrina crossed the threshold. The young woman hesitated as her gaze swept around the room, immediately picking up on the tension. The toddler had no such reservations, and upon seeing her mother, her face lit up and she made a beeline for the cot. She was muttering incoherently under her breath, as was her wont, and her nappy-clad bottom waddled comically as she toddled her way toward Bronwyn. Bryce still seemed to have no idea that she was there, and as Kayla passed by the bemused Rick, barely sparing him a glance, she was suddenly confronted by an obstacle in the form of her tall father. She frowned up at the big man who had his back to her, looking so much like him in that moment that Bronwyn smiled. What do you find so funny about this, Bronwyn? He hissed. Man big, Kayla said, her first 2 clear words since entering the room, and it sounded more like criticism than compliment. When he still didn't get out of her way, she gave him a measuring look, drew back her leg, and, Kayla, no. Bronwyn shouted in horror, just as the little girl kicked her father on his calf. Bryce staggered a little, shocked rather than hurt, and whirled around, scanning the room desperately for a few seconds before dropping his gaze to the mutinous tiny girl before him. Not even knee-high to him and still in nappies, but she refused to back down. Kayla, go. She stated like a queen, sweeping by her enthralled father. When she reached her destination, she stopped and stared up at her next obstacle with a fulminating glare. The bed was too high for her to climb onto, so the beautiful little imp with her mop of silky brown hair and her big ice blue eyes swept beguilingly back to the tall man she had just slighted and undid him with a charming smile before lifting her arms demandingly. Up, peas! She commanded with the air of one accustomed to getting her way. The please was just a formality, and her father was helpless to do anything but obey. He picked her up reverently, holding her close for just an instant longer than she liked, and she squirmed uncomfortably until he settled her onto the cot beside her mother, before shifting his piercing scrutiny to the babysitter whom he had only just noticed. I'm sorry, Bronwyn, Katrina spoke uncertainly from the doorway, unnerved by Bryce's direct stare. When you were late, I called the restaurant and they told me what had happened. I spoke to the doctor before bringing her here, and he said that you weren't contagious. I have a date, and I thought, you thought that you'd leave a little girl in hospital with her sick mother? Bryce completed incredulously. Well. The woman looked uncomfortable, and Bryce veered his furious gaze back to Bronwyn, who had her forehead resting on Kayla's as she and her daughter communed without words. It was such a striking picture that he paused for an instant before launching an immediate attack. This is the type of irresponsible people you entrust our daughter's care to? Katrina's eyes widened at his revealing words, and Bryce turned to face the young woman again, ignoring the surprised expression on her face. Thank you, miss. Your services will no longer be required. Rick, please give the young lady whatever money is owed to her. I can pay my own babysitter, Bronwyn hissed furiously, but he kept his back to her, ignoring her, while Rick led Katrina out of the room. He turned to face her, and she repeated her claim. I can pay my own babysitter, damn you. seeing that you have just lost your low-paying job, I don't think that you're in any position to be stubborn on this issue, Bronwyn. Kayla was glaring up at Bryce furiously, and her scowling little face immediately distracted him. Hey there, Angel. His voice gentled as he crouched down beside the bed to meet her eyes. Why so cross? Mummy sleep, she admonished. Shoo. He blinked for a startled instant, before lifting his gaze to Bronwyn's shadowed eyes. It appears that our daughter has a lot more common sense than either of us does. He smiled fondly down at the toddler, who was lovingly stroking her mother's hair. You're in no condition to argue, Bronwyn. Just do as I say. She gasped at his nerve and was about to protest when he hunkered down in front of Kayla again. Hi, sweetheart, do you know who I am? His eyes were trained on Kayla's perfect little features. She was an enchanting combination of both parents. She had his eyes of blue eyes so pale that they sometimes looked almost gray. Man, Kayla responded shyly before popping her thumb into her mouth and laying her head on her mother's chest. That's right. He nodded. Rick re-entered the room silently, and Kayla dragged her thumb out of her mouth long enough to point at him. Man, she informed helpfully, and Bryce swiveled his head, caught sight of his brother, and nodded with a grin. That's your Uncle Rick. Rick looked startled to hear himself introduced as such, startled and then pleased. He seemed to swell with pride. I am your daddy. Can you say daddy? What do you think you're doing? Bronwyn was so appalled by his blasé introduction that her voice came out louder than she had intended. It startled Kayla, who blinked in shock before melting into tears. Bryce looked devastated. He stared at the crying child helplessly, not knowing what to do. Bronwyn, unable to stop herself, continued furiously, how can you just announce it to her like that? How can you simply? Kayla cried even harder, and Bryce patted the child's head and cheek helplessly. Stop ignoring me, damn you, I hate it when you do that. He looked up then, and when he saw her expression, his face darkened. It was you, he seethed. You made her cry. I thought it was something I'd done, damn you. Bronwyn blinked down at him in amazement before lifting her eyes to Rick's face in shocked realization. He can't hear me. Can he? She asked Rick, who stood just behind Bryce. The younger man said nothing and merely continued to stare at her levelly. His silver-gray eyes were unnerving in their uncharacteristic iciness. Why don't you ask me that question? Bryce asked mockingly, and she returned her gaze to his face, realizing that he had heard her question. She berated herself for being ludicrous. Of course he could hear her. Ah, but you already know the answer, don't you? He taunted and she stiffened, feeling like a fool. Kayla had stopped crying and had her head resting on Bronwyn's chest and her thumb back in her mouth. She was eyeing Bryce warily. What's your name, Angel? He asked her gently. The child refused to answer and her eyelids grew heavier as she started to slip into a doze. Her name's Michaela, Bronwyn supplied, but he kept his eyes on Kayla's face, ignoring Bronwyn again. Go on, tell me your name. He blatantly snubbed her. Kayla dragged her thumb out of her mouth and deigned to respond, Kayla. She did not bother to lift her head and barely opened her eyes as she garbled her name the way she always did. It was recognizable enough, but Bryce was staring at the child with a baffled frown. He raised his confused eyes to Bronwyn. And she sighed before repeating the name, Michaela. I named her Michaela. The frown deepened and something uncomfortably close to loathing settled over his taut, handsome features. God damn you, Bronwyn, he growled, and she gasped. He didn't like the name? She had named Kayla after him. His second name was Michael. Maybe he thought it was hypocritical of her to name their daughter after him when, as he now claimed, she had deprived him of his child. Bryce looked angry, hurt, and confused at the same time, and he kept glancing at his dozing little daughter and shutting his eyes despairingly. Bronwyn did not understand his reaction. Rick stepped forward, leveling a resentful glare at Bronwyn that baffled her even further, before laying a calm hand on his agitated brother's shoulder. Bryce looked up and grabbed Rick's hand as if it were a lifeline. "Tell me," he pleaded desperately, and Rick nodded. "Her name is Michaela, Bryce," he told his brother gently, with both his mouth and his hands. Chapter 2. Why are you doing that? Bronwyn stammered. Both men ignored her, and Bryce turned back to his sleeping daughter, with his heart in his eyes. "Michaela," he murmured, running a gentle finger down the baby's soft cheek. "What a beautiful name. What's going on here?" Bronwyn asked in a voice bordering on hysteria, before convulsing into a series of painful coughs. Kayla stirred a little, disturbed by the violent coughing, and Bryce picked the little girl up and cradled her to his chest. "Give me your flat keys. Rick and Lisa will pack your things." Her eyes were blurry with tears as the coughing tore at her throat and chest. She was unable to respond to the autocratic demand and was appalled when Bryce simply reached for her handbag and tossed it to Rick. "They're probably in there," he told his brother. The younger man nodded and turned away. "Wait." Bronwyn called painfully, trying to get her coughing under control. Bryce handed her a glass of water that she gulped down thankfully. "Why were you using sign language?" she asked urgently, her throat on the verge of giving out. Rick turned back with naked disgust on his face. "This display of ignorance is an insult to our intelligence, Bronwyn," he hissed, and her eyes widened with hurt. "I don't know what's going on here." Her voice was strained, but she hoped she managed to convey her urgency. "Can you hear me, Bryce? I haven't heard much of anything over the last 2 years, Bronwyn." He shrugged scornfully. "And you know it. You did this to me, after all." "Me?" Bronwyn did not know what to react to first: the unbelievable news that her beautiful, strong husband was deaf, or the accusation that she was somehow responsible for his condition. It was all too awful to comprehend. "But how?" Rick made an impatient sound at the back of his throat, seemingly sickened by her continued ignorance. He touched his brother's arm to gain his attention. Bryce turned to face him. "I've asked that girl Katrina where she lives." He nodded toward Bronwyn, unable to even say her name. "Some dump downtown. I'll pack a couple of bags for her and Michaela." "Pack only a change of clothes for the little one," Bryce ordered, his gaze softening as he looked down into his still sleeping daughter's pretty face. "If the rags she's wearing right now are any indication, there won't be anything worth keeping. I'll clothe my own child." Bronwyn's eyes stung with tears at that terrible insult. If only he knew how much she had sacrificed and slaved for every single item of clothing the child possessed. She had worked double shifts, bypassed meals, and taken on extra jobs to keep her baby fed and clothed. They may not have been the most expensive clothes, but they were pretty and serviceable enough for an active toddler. "Pack her toys though," he told Rick. "God knows they're probably not much better than the clothing, but she's bound to have her favorites." "What do you mean I did this to you?" Bronwyn asked, letting the matter of Kayla's wardrobe slide in favor of a much more pressing matter. He didn't respond, and she understood that he must have been lip-reading all along. She tugged at his sleeve to get his attention, and he directed his arrogant gaze down to her pinched face. "What do you mean I did this to you?" she repeated, and he frowned before turning away from her, deliberately blocking her out and making her feel about as significant as a fly. "What are you?" She diverted her gaze to Rick when she saw that Bryce was ignoring her. A neat trick that, turning his back on someone when he didn't care to know what he or she was saying. It was certainly effective. "What is he accusing me of?" Rick couldn't ignore her as successfully as Bryce could, but he was definitely doing a good job of trying. He and Bryce were speaking quietly, sometimes lapsing into sign language and cutting her out completely. Feeling muddled, exhausted, and on the verge of hysterical tears, Bronwyn had no clear idea of how to deal with this problem. The situation had just spiraled completely beyond her control, and she was too ill to deal with it. She watched as the talking men left the room and took her baby with them, and she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. She wanted to snatch her child back and run as fast and as far as she could, but all she could do was watch helplessly as the door swung shut behind them. she covered her face with her hands, feeling as wrung out as a dishcloth. Hot tears seeped through the cracks of her fingers as she allowed herself to weep for everything that she had lost and was still losing. She was so wrapped up in her own misery that the first she knew of another presence in the room was a comforting arm around her narrow shoulders. "Sho, it's okay, it's okay." Rick's pretty wife was perched on the side of the bed, her head bowed toward Bronwyn's. "You'll be all right. Both you and your beautiful little girl will be absolutely fine. Bryce will take care of you." "Bryce hates me," Bronwyn negated miserably. "Bryce could never hate the woman who has given him such a gorgeous daughter," the other woman denied. "He blames me for what happened to him," Bronwyn groaned. "And I don't even know what happened to him. How did he lose his hearing?" She lifted her tear-drenched brown eyes to Lisa's face, and the other woman frowned, her expression thoughtful. "It was an accident. Rick and I hadn't been dating for long, barely a month since the day he first walked into my bookshop, but we were serious enough that he was talking about introducing me to you guys." So Rick had met Lisa while Bronwyn was still with Bryce. She remembered how euphoric and secretive he'd been during those few weeks before she had left. She'd even teased him about it over dinner one night, and he'd stammered and blushed like a schoolboy. The memory warmed her somewhat, but Lisa's sympathetic voice dragged her back into the horror of the present. "One night Rick called me to cancel one of our dates because his brother had been in an accident. It was pretty bad. I met Bryce a few weeks later while he was still recovering in the hospital. Rick and I married about 4 months after the accident, when Bryce was well enough to attend. If I hadn't been 2 months pregnant at the time, we would have postponed the wedding. Both Rick and Bryce refused to talk about you again. I think Rick was merely following Bryce's lead on that score. He was so completely wrecked by what had happened to his brother that he would have walked over hot coals if he thought that it would make Bryce happy. From the rare bits of information about it that I managed to get out of Rick over the past 20 months of our marriage, I thought that you'd opted out because you couldn't cope with his deafness. But I didn't even know he was deaf until just now." She coughed painfully and Lisa stroked her hair soothingly. "Why did you leave him?" Lisa questioned gently. "I would never willingly have left him. I loved him. Lisa raised her eyebrows at the telling slip and nodded. "I know that now. I took one look at you this morning and I knew." "So why did you leave him?" "Because he told me to leave. He kicked me out," Bronwyn recalled miserably. "He was unhappy about my pregnancy because we had agreed to wait a few years before starting a family. He accused me of getting pregnant deliberately, of tricking him. It was awful. I don't understand." Lisa frowned. "Why would he go off the deep end like that? Surely a pregnancy is something to be celebrated?" "I don't know," Bronwyn confessed. "I left to give him some time to cool off and went to our house in Nisna. I knew that once he had calmed down enough, he would come looking for me. I never believed he wouldn't come." Her voice faded away as she remembered the pain, betrayal, and disillusionment she had felt when it became apparent that Bryce would not be coming for her. "What did you do?" Lisa asked sympathetically. "I waited. For 2 weeks I waited. Bryce is usually pretty good about keeping his temper under control, and when he does lose it he usually needs only a couple of hours for his logical thought processes to kick in again. But I'd never seen him as angry as he was that night, so I figured that it would take him a little longer than usual to come to his senses." She shrugged helplessly, battling to keep the pain she still felt at the memory from showing. "After a week, I tried calling him. But I was stonewalled. His staff had closed ranks around him. I couldn't reach him or Rick and I didn't know what to do. It felt as if my whole world had imploded." She bowed her head, after the initial disbelief and pain. The anger and resentment kicked in. "I decided that if he wanted nothing to do with the baby and me, then I wasn't going to make it easy for him to come crawling back. Not that I believed he would come back. I suppose I started thinking that way to preserve my pride. I went off the grid, no credit, no bank accounts except the one I already had in my maiden name. The only jobs I was qualified to do didn't exactly keep stellar employee records. I never believed he would actually try to find us." She shook her head dazedly. "I thought he loved me." It shamed her to admit that now, embarrassed her to confess such a foolish belief in front of this woman who was so obviously confident in her husband's love. Now he blames me for his deafness, and he's practically accusing me of stealing Kayla from him when he had made it abundantly clear that he had no interest in her. She heard the bitterness creeping into her voice. "He undoubtedly thinks that the way we've been living is beneath him, but I took good care of my baby. I fed her, clothed her, and loved her after he had abandoned us. How dare he waltz back into my life and presume that he'd be the better parent just because he has so much more money than I do." Bryce has kept pretty much to himself in the time since I got married to Rick. "He's a difficult man to get to know," Lisa said into the silence that ensued after Bronwyn ran out of steam. "But what I do know I like and respect. I can't really reconcile the picture you've just painted with the man I've come to know." Bronwyn nodded miserably. "I'm sorry," she responded, forcing the words past her tortured throat. "I don't mean to place you in an awkward position. I shouldn't have said those things." "No, that's not it at all," Lisa hurriedly corrected. "It's just that you each seem so convinced of the other's wrongdoing that there must have been some crossed wires somewhere." Bronwyn tried to agree, but she was feeling fuzzy again. Unable to concentrate, "Try to get some rest," Lisa suggested gently. "You look done in." "I didn't, would never." She could not complete the thought and was aware of nothing more as she slid into unconsciousness. She looked fragile, like the slightest touch would break her, and how he wanted to break her. Bryce glared down at the stranger who was his wife and was eaten up by pure hatred for her. This innocent-looking bitch had destroyed his life and stolen his child. The barely contained violence he felt toward her had been festering for just over 2 years, and he quite cheerfully would have strangled her in her sleep if it weren't for the fact that their daughter needed her. He watched her labor to breathe and imagined that it sounded hoarse and ragged. He remembered sounds, but sometimes wondered if his memory was accurate. For the longest time, despite his unsuccessful attempts to force it out, his most precious memory had been of her voice. Now the memory of the sweet, clear sound of her voice returned unbidden along with the bell-like clarity of her laugh and, lastly, how that lovely voice had sounded during their final argument, thick with tears and entreaties. She looked so ill. He grimaced, unwilling to feel any compassion for her. If she had worked herself into the ground, it was less than she deserved for running out on him, for stealing his child, and for crippling him. He lived in a silent world now. The only sounds he heard were mere echoes of memories and her voice, always her voice. He had hated her for haunting him, and he hated her still for looking so damned vulnerable, for being ill and weak and nearly defenseless, thereby rendering him impotent to lash out and rail at her the way he had fantasized about doing for so long. Well, she wouldn't always be sick. He could wait. Revenge, they said, was a dish best served cold. He'd been waiting for 2 years, so a few more weeks wouldn't make a difference. And how much sweeter the payback would be now that he had her very firmly within his grasp.